pre-lunch session. It's a particular pleasure to introduce Peter Gill, one of the pioneers of the use of DNA in forensic science, who's continued to contribute to the development of the subject to this very day.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. I want to talk about the challenges that we face reporting complex DNA profiles. I want to talk about the work that we've done on validation and moving theory into casework. But before I want to do that, I want to talk a little bit about the terminology. The terminology that I often hear being used are words like continuous, semi-continuous, and fully continuous. And I think these terms can be somewhat confusing, but all the software that we're using are continuous, but some are more continuous than others. And I think we should use the term qualitative to describe models that take account of allele designation, drop in and drop out, and numbers and contributors. So obviously those that take account of allele peak height can then be described as quantitative, and these models can also take account of degradation, back stutter and forward stutter, as we've already heard. But can we describe these as fully continuous? Well, there are a lot of other things going on with DNA profiling that we simply don't take account of. We have double back stutters, other stutters, and these features are typical of dimeric STRs. We don't see them so much with tetramerics unless they're over-amplified. When we do get this... Right, okay, right. The classic stutter is the back stutter, and that's 4 base pairs less than the allele. You can also get a forward stutter where you have an extra repeat unit. But you can also have a double back stutter, which is 2 units less than the allele, and so on. So you can get a whole laddering effect. We can also have a somatic allele. That's a mutation that sometimes occurs, and these somatic mutations also tend to occur in stutter positions. And when they occur, you get a much higher peak than you would normally expect. We could also take account of alleles below the limit of detection thresholds. All labs work with a limit of detection, but of course you do have alleles that may appear below that level, and then of course you're getting into the background noise. Other effects not usually taken into account, of course there is a difference between haploid and diploid cells, and there is a difference there. The instrumentation that we use is not constant. There are differences between instruments, and that can have quite big effects on the peak heights that you observe that are instrument dependent. The PCR aliquot size, that is the size of the aliquot that you actually move into the PCR, has an effect. And we should also remember when we talk about peak heights, etc., this is in turn generated by a proprietary software which has all sorts of algorithms which are used to smooth the EPG data. So we're not dealing with completely raw data. So what does this all mean? Well, I think it means that no model can be described as fully continuous, as none takes account of all of the information. Because I have seen written a number of times, we use a fully continuous model because we take account of all of the information in the EPG, but that is simply not true. Okay, so having got that out of the way, I'm going to talk not very much on validation, but just to draw attention to a couple of papers that have been recently published. This one from Hinda Haned, Keith and Nora are co-authors on this paper. Recently, DNA Commission, the International Society of Forensic Genetics, published a paper to make recommendations on the validation of software. It's quite a hot topic in our area because it is perceived to be a relatively novel topic. But I would say that software development is we can learn a lot from other disciplines, and in this paper we refer to work that has been done in ecological science, for example. So there is a lot of precedent in validation of software from other disciplines, which are very useful for us. So the validation cycle, you've got the problem, which in our case is to attach a weight of evidence to a complex DNA profile. That leads to the conceptual model, which is the mathematical formulation of the LR model. The conceptual validation, you've got to verify the theories, the assumptions are correct and reasonable, at least peer review, publication, etc. Then implementation of the model here, software validation, where you verify the software is running as expected. And then that leads to the operational validation, where the model performance is measured on relevant data sets, etc. And I'm going to describe a little bit about that. Oh, the other debate I want to touch on, because I've seen some misinformation on this as well, is the emerging debate on open source or commercial software. Again, forensic science is not the only area in science to use open source. Open source is very, very widely used throughout all scientific research, and indeed the R program itself has a huge community. I think there is no implicit reason why commercial software should be any better or more secure than open source, provided that the validation standards and version control standards are met, etc. There has been some suggestion, I won't say who from, that open source is unreliable because anyone can change the code, and I've seen some mention on that on social blogs, etc. But this is quite scurrilous, of course, because regardless of what code you use, only the developers can change the official source code. If you change the source code of an open source software, it is now a different piece of software, and it's up to you to label it as such. You're not using the official source code. But there are significant benefits, I think, to using open source. First of all, the unrestricted access allows unfettered scrutiny of what it is that you're doing, whereas commercial licenses are restricted by virtue of them being very, very expensive. We try to foster a community approach with open source, and I don't think you get the same sort of community approach with commercial software. In addition to what I just said about being restrictive, with closed source, potential users may be actually denied access if they are viewed to be a competitor by the commercial entity. So you may actually never be able to do any peer review whatsoever on this commercial software because they simply refuse to sell it to you. So I think what we can say is, in summary, is that the nature of closed source means that there is a lower level of transparency. Yes, it may be well published, but that is not the same as completely peer reviewing, because a full peer review should allow unrestricted access to whatever it is that you're trying to evaluate. So I'm going to talk about some software which we've developed. It's called Euroformix. It's a quantitative continuous software, and it evaluates stutter, degradation, and drop-in. And it's published there. It's absolutely nothing new. It's based on the Cal model, Teresa, of course, that we heard about yesterday. It's based on that model. It supports multiple contributors, replicated samples, stutters, allele dropout, drop-in, co-ancestry effect, and degradation. And we've used this model to carry out a comparative study of qualitative versus quantitative models, which is published in this paper. And to do that, we collaborated with the NFI, who gave us access to a lot of data that's listed here. that consists of primarily 2-person and 3-person mixtures from 33 known contributors. There was a very wide range of stains that were produced from this. These individuals, between 6 to 500 picograms per contributor, using 1, 3, 4 replicates per sample. DNA was either degraded or non-degraded. And we also evaluated the effect of non-filtered versus stutter filter application in the GeneMapper IDX module. Okay, so we compared Uro4Mix with LR-Mix Studio. And first of all, we look at the what happens with this data set with the known contributors, and we get a plot like this. So we've got LR-Mix on this axis and Uro4Mix on this axis, so you can immediately see that you tend to get higher likelihood ratios with Uro4Mix. Those are the false negatives that we observed with LR-Mix, and fewer false negatives which were observed with EFM. So the trend is that the larger likelihood ratios with EFM occur, and there are more false negatives with LR-Mix that you can see here. And then we compared that with the conservative method that we use, where we, for LR-Mix, we take the 5 percentile of the dropout range, and with Uro4Mix, we simulate across the parameter space and again take a 5 percentile, and that gives us a more conservative measure, which I have there. And as you can see, the number of false negatives that you get with LR-Mix are increased, and there's a small increase as well in the number of false negatives that you get with EFM. It's worth pointing out that a lot of the data, there is absolutely no difference in what you would effectively report between the two models, because I think nobody really cares if you're reporting 10 to the power of 9 or 10 to the power of 20. So I call this the effective equivalence. So I think with the quantitative models, what we are finding is actually there's a lot of redundancy of information that we have, and it's especially true with the larger multiplexes. We're getting up to 24 loci, for example. The important information really is in the allele designation.
So can I just ask for
clarification?
What was this 5 percentile of dropout? I didn't understand how that.
Well, this one.
Yeah.
That's carried out by MCMC across the parameter space. So what we're doing is we're simulating across the parameter errors and producing this distribution. Does that make sense?
Not quite, but I'll ask you later.
Okay. Okay.
Peter, did you just plot one of those sets of results against each other?
Yeah.
So have you plotted the figures on the left against the figures on the right? Is there a good correspondence between them? I mean, the ones below the line on the right.
There will be good correspondence. Yes. Yeah. Now we return to non-contributor analysis. So these are individuals that have not contributed, and now we're looking for false positives. So again, if we look at this plot here, you can see that the EFM tends to give you more false positives than LR-Mix. Okay, false positives there, and both. And with the conservative method, all the data points are shifted downwards. So effectively using the conservative method reduces the number of false positives that we see with EFM. So the tendency is that EFM actually gives more false positives than the qualitative LR-Mix model, is the message there. and to look at the data in a little bit more detail. So false negatives with LRMX in the data set, we have 28 using NLE method compared with 67 conservative method. And EFM, we have 5 false negatives with NLE, 11 with the conservative method. And false positives with EFM, 120 versus 5, and LRMX 17 versus 4. So it's a breakdown of the data. But having said that, the actual size of the likelihood ratios are actually quite small. The largest was 162 with EFM, so they tend to be less than 200. False positives with LR with both methods, using the conservative methods, gives you a likelihood ratio less than 10. And really, just to carry through, it's interesting to look at real examples. So what we found then, we went back into the data to find out where these false negatives were coming from with the qualitative model, because there are a fair number of them. And they all originate from challenging borderline cases where there's less than 50 picograms of the minor contributor. So let's just work through a case. So this is from a real case example, where a policewoman was raped in a city of Europe. Suspect was detained after a few hours, and the pathologist took a penile swab from the suspect and sent it to the DNA laboratory. And the judge is asking to know if the policewoman contributed to the penile swab taken from the suspect. So in this case, we're interested in DNA from the victim. And we got reference samples from both. So this is just some of the output from Euroformics. So here we're looking at the degradation analysis, for example. There's the EPG. So the victim is actually the low level at about 20% in this particular example. So we set the propositions. This is suspects and victim versus suspects and an unknown individual, and calculate the likelihood ratio over here. It gives us about 10 bands. And again, really following on from what Teresa was talking about yesterday, we try several different models using the log likelihood estimation, and we choose the best one. So with this, for example, the best model is with degradation but without stutter. And again, we carry out the PP plot between the fitted model and the theoretical model as described by Therese yesterday. So we've adopted this approach into our strategy, and I think it works extremely well. So again, we report the 5 percentile down here, carry out the sensitivity test as I described a bit earlier on, and that gives us around about 9.75 bands. Now, if I compare that result with that which I achieved from LRMix Studio, I get a slightly lower number of 8.98 bands. So for this particular case, these two methods are comparable. Now let's try a different analysis. So I'm using exactly the same case, but now I'm going to change the propositions. I'm not going to condition on the suspect anymore in the prosecution or the defence hypotheses. So we treat the suspect as an unknown individual. Carry out the same analysis, and actually with EFM there is remarkably little difference with the likelihood ratio. We're getting a result in the same region. The MLE method gives us around about 11 bands up there, and when we carry out the sensitivity analysis, 9.71, which is almost the same as we had when we were conditioning. Now, I want to contrast that now with the qualitative model, And with the qualitative model, there's a dramatic effect. The likelihood ratio is 6. That's not 6 bands. It's more or less neutral. So just simply by not being able to condition does seem to have quite a big effect on the qualitative model. But if I am able to condition, there is a very small effect. So the LR is neutral. So to conclude on that, if we condition on the suspect using prosecution hypothesis, victim plus suspect versus defence unknown plus suspect, it makes little difference whether EFM or LR mixed studio is used because the log likelihood ratio is 9, above 9. But if we change the conditioning, as I suggested, then it has
likelihood ratio bigger than log 10 of 9. What do you mean?
not 9 bands. Sorry.
So the log 10 should be on the other side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Log 10 of the likelihood ratio.
Yeah, it means 9 bands. It's a mistake. Okay.
And shouldn't HD be victim plus unknown?
Sorry?
Shouldn't HD be victim plus unknown?
No, we're conditioning on the suspect because it's a penile swab. So we're looking for the victim's profile in this case. Yeah. So there is little effect. But if we drop the condition, there is a big effect basically. So the conclusion from that is that minor evidential profiles in major minor mixtures are best evaluated with EFM if there are unknown contributors in the prosecution hypothesis. Now I want to move on now about moving theory into practice, and this is obviously a very important issue because unless we move theory into practice, then we're not actually going to be using it in casework. So I want to talk a bit about our experiences with that. There is absolutely no doubt in this area that education is a serious bottleneck. It is the bottleneck. It's education is the big problem. The sources, I'm just talking about from the European perspective here, which is what I'm familiar with before I continue. So, but it's interesting to see what are the sources of education in Europe. We have the European Union Agency for Law Enforcement Training, CEPOL, and that is quite a good source of funding, and they have colleges which are specifically set up to support training. So we have obtained funding from them in the past. And I'm a member of a consortium which is called Euro4Gen, which is an EU-funded project. It's got 16 partners from 9 countries, and it actually funded the development of Euro4Mix. But an important application of this grant has been funding several local workshops, so we provide training in both LR Mix Studio and Euro4Mix. Unfortunately, this grant funding runs out later this year, but there are plans to continue the legacy. In particular, there's a plan that the ISFG will pick up with summer schools, in addition to the workshops which are held at the biannual conference. And we always, at the moment, we're also quite busy preparing electronic training packages and webinars. So that's what we're doing. International Society of Forensic Genetics is particularly active in promoting these ideas. There was a body which resides under this society called the ISFG DNA Commission, and I mentioned one of the documents earlier on. And there have been 3 documents, I think, that address the issues of complex DNA profiles so far. These documents are quite important. They represent the consensus views of the forensic community. They are authored from scientists from all over the world, and they are quite important court-going documents. So what we need is education, education, education. We estimate over the past several years that we've trained more than 500 scientists in the use of LRMX Studio, and it's used by more than 40 laboratories in Europe, and it's therefore the most commonly used solution so far. One of the big problems in our area is that there are very few people who can actually do the training. So, I could probably spend my whole life doing training, and this is not really feasible. So, one of the important aspects is to run train the trainers workshops, and this has been quite successful. And we've managed to cascade the expansion of trainers outside Europe, and particularly to South America. Quite a big success in South America. So really the way to propagate the information, it's not enough, first of all, it's not enough just to produce the theory and hope that someone's going to pick it up. You actually have to go out and organise workshops and train people to use it. Otherwise, if you don't do that, then absolutely nothing will happen. So this is really important, I think. So we're now training Euroformex. We've only held one workshop on that so far, and we are generating help desks. We get a lot of feedback from individuals, which is always very welcomed, because that feedback then obviously goes back into the programming. And of course the peer review is encouraged as well with these kinds of models. Now let's turn to some recent court experience. I'm not involved with this particular one, but it is quite interesting. I think Nora might have already spoken on this.
If it's the same one, it was just the slider.
Yeah.
If it's the one.
But again, it comes back to this issue of open source versus commercial. Then in the US, there was a court challenge by the defence to disclose source code used by commercial software. And to cut a long story short, the petition was rejected by the judge, who felt that it was important to protect the commercial interests of the party. So he denied access. Now, my opinion on this is that if I do some defence work myself, and I will be talking a little bit about commercial software, it would not really occur to me to ask for the source code, because if someone gave me thousands of pages of source code, I don't really know what I would do with it, so I would never ask for it myself. But of course the point is that it should. There is a point to be made that it should be available to people who do want to examine it, I think, because it is.
So the request was for the source code just to be released to the defence, not to be made public.
Oh no! It's always. This would always be done. Never made public. No.
Yes.
No. That is not the issue. The issue is whether the code should be released to any person, albeit under confidentiality agreements, etc. Yeah.
There's Bill can probably clarify this better than I can. You can get this usually, these secret, so-called trade secrets, by what's called a protective order.
Yes.
So that the defense experts and everything would be under, and if they did leak it out, they could be prosecuted.
That does not work.
Yeah, that fails too. The judge still won't do it,
No.
even under a protective order.
Because he argues that it's a trade secret, or the judges have not yet accepted that, and it's always been successfully argued that it's a trade secret, and no, you can't have it even under
Has that
protective
gotten
order.
up to an appellate court yet, or just local?
There's cases that are working their way up, but so far it hasn't happened.
I'm just wondering, maybe we'll get a sensible panel.
Right. Okay. Just to move on, there have been some recent court experiences in the UK, and this is an interesting one. It's our Queen versus Matthew Hamlin, where there was a challenge to the use of the commercial programme. I was not involved with this one, by the way. The defence argued that they were unable to evaluate the software data in the case. But and the issue with this is that it was introduced in at relatively short notice by the prosecution. They already had a DNA analysis using a conventional method, but they wanted to supplement it with this commercial provider. Now, in this case, the commercial provider agreed to release the software for this purpose. Nothing to do with the source code, I think. This is more a matter of evaluating the software. But of course, if you're going to evaluate somebody else's software, you can't really do that in a few minutes or a few hours or maybe even a few days. It's actually a lot of effort to evaluate somebody else's software. So again, I think this is not a particularly useful approach. But what happened in this case is that there was simply insufficient time within the trial. The trial was ongoing and there was no time to allow this kind of evaluation to go on, to proceed. And I'm sure that if there was enough time, then obviously it'd be quite expensive. So I'm a bit dubious that that actually this is a feasible way forward. But what happened in this case, because the judge wanted to get the trial over and done with, he just excluded the DNA evidence based on the inability to challenge it sufficiently in the time frame given. So he just excluded it on that basis. But now this is a court experience that I was involved with, and so I just want to give you an idea of the way that I approach these problems. I was working for the defence in this case. Roberto over there was one of the prosecution scientists, and then this so this is how we deal with it anyway. So this was a complex DNA profile from a gun handle, and we were evaluating these following propositions. Prosecution, Mr. Fazal, 2 unknown unrelated individuals, and the defence hypothesis, which was me, 3 unknown individuals unrelated to Mr. Fazal. And there was an original report from South Yorkshire Police, which they gave a strength of evidence using a 1 in 1 billion, using the matching allele count method. I think Sue Pope gave a talk about the matching allele count method. It's an unfortunate method which is used in the UK, and in this particular case they gave this. Okay, so the data went to Roberto, and he used Lyra, and he calculated a likelihood ratio of 2.9 million, which was somewhat less than the figure given by the South Yorkshire Police. And then we carried out analysis using LRMX Studio, and we got an LR of 300,000. Okay, so right. So how do we explain this to a court? Now, in the UK, we have a very useful procedure which is called Rule 33.6, and that allows experts to actually sit down in a room and agree a joint statement. And this is really the only sensible way forward with this kind of data, because you can imagine if you go to court and my number is different to your number, then the court is not going to know what to make of this, especially when you say, well, both numbers are valid. And one of the lawyers involved with this case, when I was explaining it to him, is that he was under the impression that actually we're kind of measuring something like how long is a piece of string, given that you have the string, of course. But this is obviously the way they think. They find it very, very difficult to understand that we can actually get different numbers for the same evidence using 2 independently validated bits of software, and we get different numbers, but that's perfectly okay. Okay, so that's what we have to try and get to. So Rule 33.6, the idea is that obviously we don't want to confuse courts with all of this debate. The only thing that the court is interested in are the areas of disagreement. Okay, so that's what we focus on. So this is actually from the statement that we agreed. So we agreed that different solutions have been published in the peer-reviewed scientific literature to evaluate the weight of evidence associated with complex DNA profiles. the different solutions are expected to generate different numerical values. There is no recommended method or gold standard. However, the software methods used in this case, namely Lyra and LRMX Studio, are accepted as validated methods for use in forensic casework. So what we're doing here is we effectively accept each other's methods. Okay, we're not going to dispute. We're not going to go to court and say my method is better than your method. This is a debate that we simply do not want to get into. It would be very destructive, in my opinion. And then, of course, then we have to explain the different statistics. So we explain the statistics calculated by the different methods in this case are 2.9 million for Lyra, 300,000 for LRMX Studio, and then we quote the Steel and Boarding paper that suggests that a difference of about 1 order magnitude is negligible. Okay, so we say that this is the sort of variation that we would expect to see given the models that we are using. So we do not feel that this is a cause of concern.
You said 0.1 band per locus, and which would be
about right.
So it is a
yes, about
profile.
was it 10 locus? I'm not sure. I can't remember, but it will be about 1 band. Okay, 5 minutes, right. So I think I'll just speed on a bit actually, because I don't want to. So in our opinion, the forensic findings provide very strong to extremely strong support for the proposition that DNA profile has originated from Mr. Fazal and 2 unknown, unrelated contributors rather than 3 unknown contributors. So we turn it into a verbal scale because some courts are quite keen on that. But of course, all of the information is disclosed to them, so they can make up their own mind. Now, I want to talk about another case. This is R v Bailey, and this was actually reported by Therese. She reported DNA mixtures with 21 bands, and again, I was working for the defence in this case as well, and we got 9 bands with LRMX Studio, and the evidence was accepted, basically. So this is the very first example of quantitative continuous reporting in the UK, and I'm pretty sure in the whole of Europe as well. So it's nice to get a precedent. Now this other case is extremely interesting. It's New York versus Hillary, which you might have heard of this one. It's a low-level profile, and I was not involved with this, by the way, so I'm just describing what I've managed to glean from the literature. The first analysis was carried out with true allele, and it excluded the defendant. So the prosecution decided to ask the STR-mix people for a second analysis, and that resulted in an inclusion. So they made a decision to prosecute the individual, but eventually, again, to cut a long story short, the DNA evidence was eventually precluded from the trial. I think the main issue in this case was actually that the validation had not been carried out with respect to the laboratory's protocols, etc. But there is a more interesting debate behind this, which I didn't actually get into court, but this is more interesting, so I'm going to dwell on it for a little bit. The mixture was very low level, and according to Mark Perlin, again stressing that I hadn't seen the evidence, so I'm really taking this on face value, he states that it was a 1 in 250 mixture, which is extraordinary in my view, because I've never seen a 1 in 250 mixture, and in my opinion 1 in 10 is really regarded as the cut-off, because the low level is getting very close, usually getting very close to the background noise. So Mark Perlin made these kinds of, is making these kinds of statements. STR-mix is validated from 50 RFU, is what he says. I don't know if this is true or not. But he says that there was exculpatory evidence between 30 and 50 are a few that would exclude. So what Mark Perlin is saying is if you look below the limits of detection, there's actually information in there which excludes. I mean, from my perspective, it's impossible to inform an independent view without citing the actual profiles involved. But regardless of this, it does raise some interesting issues, because now we have two different bits of software. One of them is giving probative evidence and the other one is giving an exclusion. Well, they can't both be right, and yet both these bits of software are apparently fully validated and being used in casework, mainly in the USA, of course. So there are very interesting issues here, but the argument I note seems to be around very close to the sub-threshold. In my opinion, that when you're arguing about profiles which are so close to the limit of detection threshold, it is doubtful that such profiles would be considered suitable for DNA profiling in the first place. Many laboratories carry out a pre-assessment of the evidence, the EPGs, before they carry out the analysis. They will have internal guidelines which would normally prevent the extreme low-level profiles from being reported. And it goes to the point, I mean, if you've got a bit of software, if you throw a load of numbers at it, you'll get something out, but it doesn't necessarily mean to say it's meaningful. Okay, so I have to, have I got time to do? No? Are you cutting me now? Oh, okay. This is a really interesting case, actually. Another case. Can I just finish with this? Because it's from your neck of the woods, almost.
It's from Australia.
Oh, all right. It's completely different. Sorry, but no. This is an interesting case. I was involved with this one as well. But it's a tape lift, which was separately analysed by Adelaide and the Netherlands NFI. And I used STR Mix and LR Mix Studio, respectively. And the resulting LRs were 6,400 using STR Mix and greater than 1 billion from NFI using LR Mix. And that is not a mistake, by the way. So why the difference? Well, the defence raised the issue as an inconsistency to suggest the analysis was unreliable. So they said, we say the inconsistencies in the results causes there to be lack of clarity about the strength of the DNA evidence. But it's interesting to evaluate the reasons for this. The South Australia analysis actually resulted in a partial DNA profile. So there were fewer alleles. Whereas the NFI analysis was more sensitive, and it revealed an almost complete profile with very little dropouts. Now, I'm sure to us this seems almost obvious, but I can assure you, when you go to court to try to explain this, I think I was giving evidence for nearly 2 days on this, trying to explain why there were big differences. The court had difficulty in realising that realising the multiplicative nature of the LR test. So they were tending to think of it as more as a kind of a linear explanation rather than an exponential one. So the evidence was accepted on the DNA profiling, and we await a verdict, which is probably due out tomorrow. So I'll just put the conclusion up very quickly and just leave it at that. Yeah. Okay.
Well, I think Peter's left us time for one quick question.
Okay. So on the very first case example that you had, where it was a penile swab, and you looked for the suspect and you found good concordance between LR Mix Studio and
EFM, yeah.
Right. At that point, and then you took out the suspect and just looked for the victim and found that EFM performed much better. But in that case, you actually have, for the most part, demonstrated that the suspect is there, and it's his penis. So you can really assume that he's there. It would be, I think, most useful to rerun LR Mix Studio with the suspect as an assumed contributor and now do the likelihood ratio. And having done that numerous times, I would predict that LR Mix Studio doesn't quite get to the level of EFM, but would provide substantial evidence to support the presence of the victim on that swab.
Okay.
Oh,
David, can I just ask? I've got a lot of questions from that, so it's a shame we don't have much time. But just one very quick one is that those early on your plot, you had a number of points of -10 that you talked about as false exclusions, right? And so -10 presumably means minus infinity. That it was 0, was it, or?
Yeah, I mean, bear in mind some of these. We know the truth state of the profiles, but some of them may be so low level.
But that's really my point. That
yeah.
you can never exclude somebody confidently because the alternative that there's only one picture of DNA from this person can never really be confidently excluded.
Yep.
So you should really never have a likelihood ratio much less than 1.
Yep.
And so I'm concerned about very negative likelihood ratios that because you can never be 100% confident that somebody's DNA isn't there in minuscule amounts, or rarely it seems to be. But,
one very, very last
I'll
question.
make it very short. So I did read the big lash out on open source software. I think I read the same as you. And I think that you have here a brilliant example of why open source software and documenting the whole process well in publication is so valuable.
Yeah.
We have here, you've been able to check out a version of what I did, read all the papers, and implement, play around with it, and implement independently a whole new software adapted to your needs.
Yeah,
and they agree. And
they do. Yeah. Therese, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is when we set out to do this, we felt it was important to use to rewrite somebody else's software, basically, which is what we did, and we get the same answers to 10 decimal places as well. So that, in my mind, is really the best way to validate a piece of software is to independently rewrite it and compare the results. Of course, we can't do that with commercial software. Is my point.
No. I think if you really want to do it independently, it's actually better to not have the source code available.
We didn't use the source code. We wrote it. We wrote it completely from scratch.
Exactly. Okay.
Yeah.
On that counsel of perfection, let's join and thank Peter for a very interesting talk.
Okay. Thank you.